Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about blasphemy, and there is a little bit religious orthodoxy. Maybe you can make it clear with your statement about that.
Mm-hmm. What I wanted to say is that the notion of blasphemy, or the definition of blasphemy that I discussed here, means that God or religious symbols or religious persons are denigrated or vilified or something like this, or ridiculed. And this notion presupposes a particular image of God. Yeah? If I take, for example, Alexander of Hall's definition that blasphemy means that I attribute a particular characteristic to God which he does not have, yeah? Then this presupposes that I know something about his attributes. And if I say, for example, God is male, and somebody states that, no, God is female, and I say, oh, this is blasphemy, you know? But this, of course, presupposes a particular concept of God, an image of God, and I said, okay, according to my tradition, this is the orthodox notion of God, whereas according to your tradition, the female one is the orthodox. Yeah? So I can say, okay, from the perspective of my religious tradition, this is a blasphemous statement. But according to the tradition of another religious community, my statement would be blasphemous. And therefore, in pluralistic societies, they say, okay, it's not possible to take this concept or this notion of blasphemy as a starting point of ethical analysis.
Okay, I'm Joost Spaans. I'm a colleague of Christoph's from the theology department. At the end of your speech, you introduced a concept coined by Bert van den Brink, an informal something, and you kind of lost me there.
Okay.
Could you repeat that and clarify a bit how this ties in with restaurant?
Okay. Well, it's informal conception of democratic life. This means that we presuppose particular concept of, for example, of a competent citizen, or what it means to contribute to social to the public debate. Yeah? I mean, there are particular claims we have. Yeah? For example, if somebody just bases his argument on religious beliefs, it's quite hard to say that this is a valuable contribution to public debate within religious societies. Okay, there's a debate about this. Let's go into this. But you know, the notion of informal conceptions of democratic life means that we share something, we presuppose something when we talk about our community, as it were. Yeah? And if I say that a particular form of protest, like for example flag burning or a call for boycotts, is an expression of an anti-democratic attitude, whereas the depiction of a religious symbol and the indecent, in an indecent way, is a valuable contribution to public debate. This presupposes a particular concept of informal citizenship, for example. Yeah? An informal concept of citizenship. And this is quite influential, of course. Yeah? I mean, in my view, nothing is morally wrong with publicly burning a privately purchased copy of a newspaper or so. Yeah? Or even with black flag burning. I mean, it's just an act of expression, and it's communicating a sort of attitude. But if this informal conception is shaped in a particular way, for example, you say, okay, this is an expression of religious zealousness or so, then it's problematic.
If I remember correctly, the sentence was socially accepted and culturally dominant informal conceptions.
Okay.
Well,
I don't.
I was very curious, but how the culturally dominant fits in with the rest of the sentence,
okay.
The issues of hegemony and
power
relations
that's of course
affect the second half of the argument.
Yeah.
Or not.
Well, that's very important. Yeah. In my view, it's desirable to have a pluralistic concept of informal. Or a pluralistic, informal concept of democratic citizenship, so that people from different traditions can contribute or can tie in this debate. Whereas if there's one hegemonic form of informal concept of a democratic life, then it's problematic, you know. Then it's of course quite easy to tie in for example, secular humanists, yeah? But it's problematic for Amish people also to make their argument, to contribute to debate, yeah. And this is of course, yeah, it's quite important. But whether it's socially or culturally dominant, I don't know.
What's the domination? Okay. I need to understand better the argument on Mackinnon's thing. Could you? My alarm bells went off just at the sheer mention of the name. So.
Okay. Well, it's just a sort of when I constructed this argument, it came to my mind since I've read this sometime, and in my view, Mackinnon's argument is that pornography sets particular felicity conditions of women's speech against pornography, right? So it's not possible to argue against pornography or to say no to sexual intercourse, since the no is perceived more or less as a yes. And it's somehow similar in my view in my third argument. Yeah. So there are possibly religious believers who pro this, but want to make an argument within the framework of a democratic society. Yeah. Whereas they are perceived as being out of having stepped out of this democratic society and wanting to sort of having a revolution or so, and to restricting freedom of religion. Whereas nobody claimed, or at least many Muslims and many Christians did not claim that we have to restrict freedom of religion, freedom of expression. They just wanted to that the editors apologize or something like this. Yeah, they wanted to be recognized, and this was not possible. So obviously, if I'm right with this argument, then it's possible that because of this informal concepts of democratic life, they are silenced in a particular way. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure, because this, I think we'll come back to this in the discussion. The analogy is in Mackinnon's argument, pornography is a systematic violation of the woman's right to actually have anything to say about this. So even if you say no, the no is implied in a set of power relation whereby you're just being coquettish, you're just playing hard to get, in fact. Hence the feminist slogan, when a woman says no, it actually means no. So there it's impossible to have, and then if you say no to pornography, you're against sex. You are, a Puritan or whatever. So the analogy there would be that anybody who would claim a religious argument is immediately deprived of the right to debate within a democratic system. To claim that this is religiously tainted puts you outside the frame of reference of a democratic institution. Is that pushing your argument too far? I'm sure it is.
I think
refocus then. Yeah. Would you want to refocus it in your terms?
Well, I think the important thing is that it's possible, in my view, that protesters against blasphemous acts are, as it were, silenced. Yeah, they are made voiceless because of the felicity. Yeah, you all know to use this word now. Because of the perception of the mainstream discussion about this issue. Yeah, but it's an important matter. It's a topic that matters. That really matters to them. Yeah. And they want to say something about this. But people say, this is an expression of a new totalitarianism or something.
Because if you're religious, you're a fanatic. If you're a fanatic, you can't have an argument. You're having a religious argument, so you're fanatic, so you can't have an argument.
It's perceived as a threat against our society and not as a contribution or something like this.
Okay, so I think that is the analogy with the Mackinnon argument. We need to come back to it on the discussion. There's a lot of you, I'm sure, things to say on this. The other question I had was, because you talked about blasphemy a lot more, I was struck as you were talking, there are so many other forms of offense, of public offense. For instance, burning the flag, or calling the Queen names. Now, is that legally and morally blasphemy, or does it have actually a different, it's a genuine question, does it have a different legal status if I don't know, burn portrait of Utrecht in the middle of the street, or if I write the satanic verses and say that the House of Orange does S&M every Saturday afternoon, which we all know they do anyway. Is that blasphemy, or does it, what is the status when it is a political authority instead of a religious one? Is it still blasphemy? What is the constitution? We need the law faculty here, but or does it have a different status? That was a question. It's a genuine dumb question.
Actually, I don't know the way it is discussed in legal literature, but it's some authors deal with, for example, this majesty is something in terms of blasphemy or flag burning. But in my view, that's not appropriate. You know, there's a quite specific notion of blasphemy, which is a theological notion, and you can refer to profound offense or to defamation of Her Majesty or so.
So I guess I'm getting to the point: can there be a secular blasphemy? Can be a secularist? If you burn the flag or if you burn the Queen, is that still blasphemy, or is there implicitly there a religious? In the actual positing of the question, it just came to me because of the very detailed cartography you were giving us of religious blasphemy. I thought in America, if you burn the flag, you go to jail. I'm sure here people wouldn't be very happy, but certainly if you make public statements against Her Royal Highness, you would be in trouble. So is that not a secularist blasphemy? I was just wondering.
Well, the second argument, of course, the argument from offense applies to many of these issues. You don't need to have a religious offense. It's a profound offense refers to, for example, political aspects or so as well. But I would hesitate or even reject it to call this blasphemy. But this is more or less a terminological issue now.
But it would be interesting politically if it has been legally coded as.
Okay.
Or is it this lèse majesté is the name that comes to mind. Lèse majesté is offending the political figure, particularly the monarch. And it may be closer to blasphemy than we think, but we will pursue this with our friends in the law faculty.
I'm Marloes van Noordhout, a PhD candidate from the law faculty. Just to clear this up, well, in legal terms, blasphemy only refers to defamation of religion, and defamation of persons on the grounds of their religion is something different even. That's really defamation of persons, and offending the monarch is also a different concept, defamation of the monarch. So blasphemy is just really defamation of religion.
Specifically.
Yes.
And it has a legal status of its own.
Yes.
Yeah, right now still, but within a few months, I think in the Netherlands it will be gone. So.
But blasphemy will be gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm Vincent Brummer. I'm an emeritus professor in philosophy of religion here in Utrecht. I like your paper. I want to say something about your argument from offense. I agree with the point that blasphemy is offensive to believers, because blasphemy is an offense against that which or those beliefs in which believers seek their own identity as persons. So it's an offense against the believers at the same time. But what's wrong with offending? Hirsi Ali argues that she has a right to offend.
Yes,
and she argues for the right to offend. My problem with offending is that this is fundamentally anti-democratic, because an offense is not something which allows a counter-argument. It's not an argument. Offense is not an argument. Why? Because it doesn't allow a counter-argument. It doesn't allow for an argumentative response. It's not a move that you make in an open debate. It's a debate stopper, and in that sense, it's a dictatorial ploy. And I would say, and then I come to your point about the informal conceptions of democratic life. I think this is essential in democratic life, that we want a society, if it's democratic, where our relations with each other are based on open debate. And therefore, in that kind of context, offense as a dictatorial ploy is immoral.
You know, my objection against considering the argument from offense a valid argument was, or the most important objection was, that being offended, again, depends on particular religious values or beliefs which are important to my identity. Yeah? So if this is true, then I have problems within my normative framework to make the claim that there is a claim not to be offended or to have one's religious beliefs treated respectfully. But I agree with you that we do have a well-informed intuition that something is morally wrong with this, or no, morally problematic with this. Yeah? And therefore, and if I have 5 minutes, I would like to
You have
extend this.
an hour and a half.
Therefore, I would like to suggest another normative concept in order to deal with this. You know, and I'm referring to a German philosopher Andreas Goethe. It's not so important. He distinguishes 3 different levels within society, within morality. The first level is the level of strict duties and corresponding rights. Yeah, this is what I consider morally wrong in my normative framework here. The second level is the level of obligations, moral obligations, but these obligations do not correspond to moral rights or moral claims. These are more somehow broader and even weaker obligations than moral duties and strictness, but nevertheless it's not a matter of courtesy, it's a matter of morality. Yeah? Examples of such mild obligations are according to the gratitude or friendliness. A third level, according to, the third level is quite well known, is this is supererogatory actions, which means actions which we consider to be good, yeah, even very good, but we are not obliged to do this. For example, helping a person, if this is related if this is very risky to me, if I would have to risk my own life, for example, in order to save somebody, we say, okay, this is very good if you do this, but otherwise, if you don't do this, we cannot blame you. Yeah? For example, Mother Teresa is the example of a moral saint, as it were, but this is supererogatory. You know, this is good, this is very good, we consider it praiseworthy, but we are not obliged to do so. There's no moral obligation to act like Mother Teresa did. And my proposal would be that the argument from offense could be phrased in terms of a mild moral obligation on the second level. Yeah? So that we say it's not only a matter of courtesy not to offend others, it's a moral issue. But it's not morally wrong to make and also to exhibit an art piece where we can expect that this will offend religious believers. Yeah? But what I do say with this is that saying that there is a right to offend is at least misleading. Yeah? So it's an implication of freedom of expression, even of freedom of religion, but it's not an original human right or an original moral right in my view.
Yishi Ali argues that I have a right to offend because it's not against the law. In the society we should keep ourselves to the law.
Okay.
And with everything that's within the law is okay. Now this, I think, is just confusing morality with the law.
Sure, yeah.
Because it's not illegal to be immoral.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean to be immoral is right.
Yeah.
Morally. It may be legally not forbidden, but that doesn't make it moral.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
but you
so
know,
in that sense, I would agree with the steps of yours.
Yeah.
I mean, on the legal level, it's okay to offend, but that doesn't mean that it's moral.
Yeah, but
because I mean, because it is counter to the kind of society, democratic society that we want.
Okay, I agree with this. But my question would be, what do you mean by saying that it's not moral? Yeah, I tried to, in my paper I made the argument, or I investigated the question whether something is morally wrong. On the other side, I would agree to say, okay, it's not morally good or morally desirable to offend somebody. Yeah. But on the other hand, I would say that it's morally desirable to have the possibility to produce and exhibit art pieces or novels that are experienced as offensive. I think so, yeah. Yeah. But this is not a contribution to public debate. This is somehow different. Whereas submission, for example, the film, is both. You can perceive it as a piece of artistic documentary film, and as a contribution to public debate, in my view.
I would like then to return to the socially accepted and culturally dominant informal conceptions of democratic life.
Yeah.
And as often is the case in arguments that are either based on, should we call it, philosophical liberalism or on Habermasian concepts, I'm always a little bit puzzled by how issues of domination and power fit into the equation. I remember a debate at the London School of Economics on precisely the question of offence and blasphemy. And I grew up in the British colonial system, so I'm well placed, in Australia, so I know that being able to offend and take a good knocking is part of a good British education. A citizen ought to be able to, this is the model of the debating societies. You're supposed to, attack and be attacked and take a beating, and that's part of being, a good debater. If you watch the debates in the House of Commons, it's really all boys throwing insults at each other. They're extremely witty, very funny. It's very well done. This doesn't go very well with the Dutch public debate, which is much more sort of either completely brutal or terribly kind of cozy and self-congratulatory. But irony and certain type of culturally loaded assumption don't translate across the UK and the Netherlands, let alone across other cultural divides. So could I probe you a little bit on maybe to say things that don't even maybe fit in particularly with your philosophical background, but or they may. But how does the issue of a culturally dominant set of assumptions really square with the question of offend or offending? Do we have the right, do the British have the right to say to the Dutch, you should have a better sense of humour and take a knocking, your sense of humour is pathetic, which by the way it is, but okay. By the same token, do we have the right to say to the Muslims, you should actually, take a bit of lighten up a bit, it's blasphemous what we're doing, but be like us. How dare you not be like us? It seems to be the assumption behind this idea that there are, yes, socially accepted, culturally dominant, informal conceptions of democratic life, but somehow they don't matter. What do we do with the power differentials?
Actually, I'm inclined to say that we are allowed to do this in a specific way, namely in the following. In my view, it's necessary in pluralistic societies to sort of develop emotional and cognitive competencies that enable us to productively or at least peacefully cope with challenges with encountering the different. Yeah? So, I mean, it's not avoidable for me to be confronted to other worldviews, and which I might experience offensive. And therefore, at least in order to be able to contribute to public debate, and in order to be able to make the claim that this might be morally wrong, I need to presuppose a sort of emotional or cognitive competencies, which I call civic virtue. This is sort of part of civic virtue. Otherwise, it's possible. So I cannot say you need to develop this. You have to. But I can say, if you want to make the argument that I'm right, that I'm wrong in offending you, then I need to presuppose that you're a person who's able to live in a multiculturalist or in a pluralistic society, and therefore you need to have this sort of competencies. That's what I would argue.
there would be a comment to the culturally dominant group as well.
Well, no, yeah, of course. Yeah,
It
sure.
would work.
Yeah, also to the culturally dominant group, sure. Yeah. So this applies both to secular people, to religious people, and to all people.
And does it matter that we can all predict what the reply of the culturally dominant group might be? Which is stuff it, I'm the cultural dominant group. If you want to live in this country, respect our laws. Which is in a nutshell the Angel-Siali argument. That's why she goes to the law to actually answer both a moral and a theological argument. It's not illegal, so I can get away with it. What is, I mean, it's in fact an objection to the Habermasian argument. We can go to Wilders and try to reason them into accepting that he has to open up and be tolerant. We can also predict what the answer would be. Do we have something to say to that, whether it is profound nationalism or profound contempt for fellow human beings that goes with that proposition?
So my reply probably would be, but this is very short now. I mean, I don't want to treat people equally in my reply, but I need to treat them as equals. Yeah? This means that if there are people who are especially vulnerable because of the status as a minority and so on, then they probably deserve, or I would say that we are obliged in the sense of the second level to treat them more respectfully than the mainstream society, which is in a very powerful position. Yeah? Or to say negatively, where it's indecent to offend the people who are in a very weak position. And it's not only indecent in a sense of courtesy or so, it's even it's a violation of the obligation on the second level. Whereas I would say, okay, you know, the person who is very strong, for example, you know, this secular humanists in Holland or in the Netherlands, they're or people like Wilders, Siali, Philips, and so on. They're quite strong. Yeah, and I would say, okay, you have to be able to cope with my challenges, and I can be a little bit more ironic against them.
I was wondering what the right to offend, if you can morally judge it, whether it is intentional offense or a consequence of religious criticism or critical religion, who are received by the religious people as a blasphemy. Is not intended. This is morally. There's a great difference between an intended and unintended blasphemy. Yeah. That is only meant as a critic of religious beliefs.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Well, that's an important point in my view. But it's hard to say whether a person intended to offend others or not. There are utterances which are bound to offend. You know, we can easily predict that it is offensive to Christians, to a particular group of Christians at least, to submerge a crucifix in a box of urine. I mean, everybody can predict that this is offensive. Yeah. Even if Serrano says, "Well, I did not intend to offend the religious believers," but it's sort of subtext of your question might be the so-called lange Thelen argument in the Netherlands, that people say, you know, these Christians, Muslims, and Jews, they are quite especially susceptible. They just have to cope with it. And in my view, there is some truth in this argument if we stick to the level of religious offense. But the problem of it is that religious offense shades into racism. So I can analytically distinguish the second and the third argument, but it's not possible to say, okay, this utterance is only offensive and the other one is even socially damaging. And if we're on the level of the third argument, the argument from exclusion, the so-called Langatinen argument, or the argument from extraordinary susceptibility doesn't apply. Yeah? Since it's not important what I perceive as a believer, according to the third argument, but it's important whether I'm Lord in the eyes of the others. Yeah? So the secular humanists, or whatever, the fellow citizens. And then this argument doesn't apply, and therefore this argument is, in my view, quite dangerous. Yeah? I mean, we cannot limit it to a particular scope. And it's even, if we raise this argument, if we make this argument, there is a sort of risk that we contribute to the particular informal conceptions of social life, according to which it's just an expression of religious zealousness. To feel offended and so on, yeah. You're not able to act as a competent citizen, yeah. Since you don't have the emotional and cognitive competences Baumgartner claims you need to have, yeah. Yeah, it's only probably it's in think about this.
Okay, my name is Sarah Kajleuven. I wanted to come back to your normative framework and the way you set up the idea of that looking for norms that are independent from particular religious traditions on the one hand, and then I also wanted to come back to your the first objection in your second argument blasphemy from offense, where the objection is that offense in the end is a subjective experience. So I'm kind of trying to think through these particularities and the subjective, and wondering what happens if one tries to set up the grounds for thinking about these things, and particularly in a public debate, so set up the grounds for public sphere and public debates, while kind of evacuating particularities as a form of judgment and evacuating the subjective. And I'm wondering if you're not setting up the debate as such that with the question of power and domination, certain particularities will be part of the norms that you use to judge, and certain subjective experiences will become part of the norms. And setting up the debate like that actually makes particular groups vulnerable for these arguments of, what is blasphemy, whose blasphemy is accepted or not. So already the way you set it up might not, I don't know how to say it very well. It sets up particular groups in different ways in relation to these questions. And then, following on from that, I was wondering what would be the objections from your side to try to think these questions about blasphemy and what is morally right and wrong with particularities and subjective experiences, with particular attachments, with the idea that we have a public sphere where people come in with particular attachments.
That's really quite important aspect, which might be a weakness of an argument. But concerning the first question, what I'm saying is I'm misframing the issue. I'm probably my moral theory that I'm applying is part of that I'm unjustly framing the issue, since particular members of the society are, as it were, ruled out from the outset. Yeah, they can't make their argument in, for example, religious terms. Of course, there's a huge debate on this, but in my view, it's simply not possible to make one normative theory when you're referring to wait a second. When you're raising the question whether something is morally wrong, in the sense that you have a claim to be protected against it. Yeah. So I mean, what I'm providing here is a prima facie reason, at least, to make a law against it. So therefore, I really want to have a strong reason to limit freedoms of others. And this is, in my view, it's impossible to develop a normative theory that deals with this, say, thin concept of the right and so on, in religious terms. Yeah, so it might be possible to translate it in secular arguments or philosophical arguments, and that's what I hope at least, yeah, and what I would like to contribute to. So therefore, I know that it's a problem, and there are some ideas in Fregel's recent work on abnormal justice which might be really interesting, which might be more dynamic theory. And this might be useful to look into this direction, but for the time being, I need to insist that concerning the thin concept of the right, really justice claims, we need to refer to reasons which are accessible to all. What kind of approach could I propose? I mean, in my view, it's quite important not merely to look at this thin approaches, yeah, and on the more or less second level or so, on the second also on the level where there's obligations that do not correspond to moral rights. It's quite easily possible to get in a sort of dialogue between different groups within society, and yeah, again, Habermas calls this I forgot the term, but he's saying that the ethos of a particular society, yeah, that this might be influenced by particular concepts of the good. So this that needs not to be universal, yeah? But what is, as it were, in between the thin skeleton of the right, this might be more dynamic, yeah. And there I see opportunities or possibilities to deal with multiple cultures and to give them more space or so. And therefore this second level is quite important, you know, since the question is, one question is, do I have a right to do something, for example, to offend somebody, and perhaps I'm about to say, okay, it's true, I cannot make the claim that it's forbidden, but nevertheless I can say it's an obligation not to make use of this right. That's somehow tricky, yeah? But nevertheless, I mean, it's not forbidden to be, for example, to break a promise. But nevertheless, we are more or less convinced that usually it's a moral obligation to keep one's promise. I mean, that's a part of the concept of a promise.
It was the example of Serrano made me think of another angle to the discussion of blasphemy, which has quite a history, certainly in philosophical discussion. And it is the angle of taste, of good or bad taste, which sounds very 18th century, I'm aware, but I'm becoming more 18th century as the day progresses. Whether you are a believer or not, there is something objectionable on a number of grounds about having anything immersed in a bath of urine, let alone a religious image. The idea of a violation of standards of, here we go, it's difficult, common taste, minimum elegance in our interaction as humanoids, and then a violation of what we could call taste, but is the wrong term, we need something else. Taste sounds more aesthetic than I need it to sound. A violation of those standards of, let's call it good taste, as a forms of violence, as a violence in deeds. And of course, there's a long history of this in philosophy. You can think of the Sadian tableaus of where body fluids and abject kind of sort of body parts are exposed, and abject material is exposed as a way of violating the sanctity of certain values and the integrity of a certain idea of the human body. Can we work with that? Can we do anything with that? Is it an intrinsically conservative argument? I'm thinking again of the analogy with pornography, and there are of course many jokes about this. Now, if I like it, it is necessarily tasteful, so it's not pornography. If other people's like it, it's bad taste, so it's absolutely pornography, which is one of the kind of working definition of porn. If I like it, it's eroticism. If others like it, it's porn. Because what I like has to be intrinsically tasteful, of course. So that's the joke part. But the more serious part is that there is a sort of a violence in pornography in the structural relationship, because the woman has very little to say there, but also in the deeds. There is something in the ugliness of this. Does the argument out of ugliness carry any value here, or is it just something that we cannot agree upon because of a number of reasons? People talk about the barbarism of our era, the vulgarity of our era, the absolute proliferation of relatively humiliating and kind of dirty images left, right, and center. Can we go anywhere with this, or do you think it's doomed as an argument? I'm thinking on my feet. I'm not sure how I feel about it.
My view is it's quite interesting and valuable to see this as a form of violence, and I would agree in this. But I would ask, okay, you know, being violent doesn't mean or necessarily mean that it's bad or that it's wrong, you know? I mean, there are certain criteria or requirements for a good normative theory, namely, for example, it needs to be in accordance with our well-informed moral intuitions. Or it needs to be able to criticize them. So this is obviously not in accordance. An act like this we have a sort of intuition that something is wrong with it. Yeah, we have emotions that indicate this, but I cannot see the reason until now, at least. I can't see the reason that it would make it possible to criticize my well-informed intuition, or to provide reasons why it's morally wrong or why it's problematic. And therefore I would say okay, it's hermeneutically valuable, this approach, but in the discourse of justifying a claim or so, we need to have sort of different reasons. Not therefore you know, there's also Leon Kass, United States ethicist, made an argument from sort of disgust. He used another word concerning cloning human beings. And he said, well, this indicates we know that we feel something that this is wrong. Mm-hmm. And he more or less says, and therefore it is morally wrong. But this, of course, isn't true. I mean, the taste, for example, can change. Yeah, and for example, the emblematic acts of the prophets in the Old Testament, were perceived as being highly problematic and distasteful and offensive and so on. But nevertheless, they contributed to promoting the theology of old Israel, at least retrospectively seen.
If we work with the Kantian equation that good taste is morally sort of ordained or in accordance with moral standards, then, which is a pretty major Kantian equation to work with, then categories of citizens, let's call them the artists or the provocateurs, would have to be allowed. I'm thinking of the Serrano example again, to precisely can violate that by deliberately acting in an untasteful manner, which is of course a moral offense, that they know perfectly well that they're doing that. You don't insert anything in a bucket of urine, let alone a religious image. So in a sense it would broaden, in this particular case, it would broaden the spectrum of what you can morally object to than it would be.
Yeah, but actually I would agree on this, that we say, okay, one and the same action more or less is evaluated differently if Serrano or another artist makes it in a museum and exhibits in a museum, or whether Geert Wilders or Balkenende or Wouter Bos makes it as representative of the people. I mean, that's a difference, right? Or the rector magnificus of the university. Yeah? I know it's...
But I'm just also thinking of the Bauman argument, how much we can take in terms of bad taste, abjection, public humiliation. And the images I have in mind now are these television reality shows. Sorry if I sound like a geriatric, but there you go. Where people actually get bodies covered in all kinds of things. It's pretty humiliating, some of the stuff that people do in these survival reality shows. I just watch them in my gym, but they get covered in chocolate or something that looks like chocolate. Would be eating. There's a kind of a public ritualization of what I would call humiliations of the body that seem to just go down as entertainment. Now, Bauman argues that there has been a kind of a barbaric impoverishment of our moral imagination as a result of the horrors of our history. That we have actually become more callous and I would say more tasteless in terms of the terms of this discussion. As a result, it puts it down to the Holocaust, to the history of colonialism, that there is a neo-barbarism in our ability to put up with what I would call violations, acts of violations. And he also argues that it is getting worse. So does Eric Hobsbawm in his history of the 20th century, saying it is actually an impoverishment of the moral and aesthetic sensibility. That we seem to be able to take so much crap and think, oh, this is funny, there's somebody being covered in vomit. Oh, that's excellent, yeah, which is an example from, the MTV example I was thinking of. And I was wondering whether here again we could sort of come back, because you said taste is historically mutable, absolutely. But there are many scholars who are saying that our taste is actually shrinking, and there is an impoverishment of our moral and aesthetic sensibility, and that would probably play a card in the favor of looking again at the boundaries of what would that be morally tolerable or not. But we're kind of verging on the conservative, I know, but I just wanted to throw it in.
If you look at the debates on media, for example, in the 50s or so, they were discussing talk shows. And talk shows were exactly like Jungle Camper, I don't know how they call it now, nowadays. And they said, oh, God, what's this for a kind of television here? Whereas television, this talk shows nowadays is quite high-level television, so I'm not so sure, or Norbert Elias might also, I'm not so sure, I'm hesitating to objectify, as it were, or to take taste or manners also as something which is which provides reasons. Yeah, it might be really, again, it might be hermeneutically interesting and valuable, but then again, we need to look for reasons in order to show that this is not only irritating or so, but also wrong, or something we don't want to tolerate.
Although Bauman would connect it to a history of, I think that the history argument may want us to make it more than just a question of personal taste. Maybe there is when blasphemy is becoming banality, if the shift is from blasphemy to banality, then we need to look at what we consider the thresholds of tolerability, and then at what particular point actually we could write a history of our increasing tolerance for offense, for insult. And there are indications of that.
Actually, also if you look at the films, at Jesus films, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were films where Jesus is only seen from the back, and the hair of his body was shaven, since it's anti-divine, as it were, to have to be hairs, right? And nowadays there are films like this Mel Gibson film, Jesus has hairstyle, and not only this. So obviously things are changing, right? Yeah. And it's interesting, but again, I wouldn't say that it provides a sort of basis for an argument, but nevertheless it's interesting in order to be irritating to look at it.
Some of the work that journalists are doing on an ethics of reporting and an ethics of journalism that would actually draw attention to the extent to which we're becoming accustomed to spectacle of human misery, dismembered corpses, and simply the visual exposure to this shifts the boundaries of what really is the violation of the moment of, we're not on blasphemy, we're sort of on offense and insults, and how the unbearable becomes the everyday, and that shifts the terms of the debate, and sort of the journalism, the ethics of journalistic reporting that would take this media overexposure of the unbearable as part of what we need to take into account in our discussion of at what particular point does offense kind of take into, maybe media ethics more than actual media could be part of this discussion.
You know, at the opening of this exhibition in Bach, you said something about the sexualization of the culture, more or less, yeah? And I agree with you that this is something we intuitively say, well, we don't want this, yeah? So I share the intuition that parties with sexual intercourse practiced on publicly, visibly or so is not only somehow disgusting or so, but it's wrong. But it's not wrong because I have a sort of feeling of disgust or so, but because I'm able to give reasons, yeah, that it's morally wrong to confront particular sort of people, children, for example, or so, with images like this.
And then, of course, this major part of the post-secularist turn. There is, I kind of looking at Sarah now, a lot of feminists of all generations, particularly younger ones, saying we don't want this over-sexualization, this pornographization of the public space. We want to put limits to it. And I don't know what arguments they would be using. Sarah, if you want to come to my rescue, there wouldn't be tasteful arguments, I'm sure, although some of the ugliness of those images may play a role.
The sexualization of public sphere confronts me with certain expectations of my fellow citizens, of boys, for example. Yeah. So if I don't wear particular underwear or so, I don't know, but you can I'm a sort of outlaw in this society, or I'm not considered being an acknowledged peer or so. Yeah. And this is something I don't want to be confronted with, and I have good reasons for this. You know.
And when an old person of our younger generation puts on a veil to say, I don't want to wear a headscarf, well, I don't want to be mistaken for being part of this culture, because I do not see my model of emancipation to necessarily be the same thing as the pornographization or the over-sexualization. All we can say is you're backward and you're not you're against emancipation. So there are kind of that. It was that what we were trying to talk about in the bucket. I think it's that non-dialogue that is happening, and I think is one of the problems with the post-secular condition. In fact, we have more and more women of all kind of religious background rejecting this equation, emancipation equals over-sexualization. If wearing a headscarf can protect us from this or whatever, and that is part of this move. That's where I think the whole issue of visualization, media culture would play a role, and to go back to that sentence, in the socially accepted and culturally dominant informal conceptions of, in this case, emancipated citizenship. And I think there we have some more digging up to do on the positioning of the female body and the over-sexualization of it as a player, with very shifting expectations of what is culturally dominant.
To me, I passed earlier on because I find it a very difficult debate to do. Like I wasn't considering myself as somebody who has particularly the tools to do that debate. I don't know if some of the gender people have those tools, because especially connected to the question of morality and what is morally wrong, I think the debate is so difficult because from a feminist point of view, we don't want to fall back on those arguments, certain kind of moralist arguments, which not even because I don't want to identify with those arguments, but because of the power question that those morality arguments have been used against the emancipation of women, against the emancipation of certain people. So we don't want to fall back into those arguments. And then it becomes difficult to criticize that sexualization, right? Like we need to find a whole set of different arguments to criticize it, not the moral arguments that we know. And I tend to pass because I don't know, I haven't found it yet. So
but
the new gender students must find it.
But that's interesting for me. I mean, if there is an argument from the liberal tradition, for example, yeah, that provides reasons for what you are claiming, you nevertheless say, I don't make use of this argument because it was used against me. I mean, that's for me quite a new perspective, actually.
Because, I mean, not against me personally.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But structurally, those arguments have been so embedded in a number of power relationships, a number of other arguments, So I think from a feminist tradition, you know, you're very careful and cautious with those arguments, and at the same time, clearly we also don't have the new arguments yet, so it's, yeah.
Okay.
One of the trends that has sociologically been reported is a certain retreat from sexuality as the terrain for the formulation of emancipatory politics in the younger generations, whether that is the new virginity movements and the, you know, the deliberately, explicitly anti-sexuality movements, or a changing of the field or the points of reference. I'm thinking of an article in TCS just come out on, I keep quoting it, Benjamin Noyce, YS, on returning to Foucault, who argues against sexual liberation, saying there is no liberation through sexuality, there is only liberation from, because sexuality is completely saturated with power relations, and it is completely dominated by consumerism. It's about consuming certain bodies, certain trends, so retreat from, liberation from, going against the entire queer theory reading of Foucault as on the contrary, the sort of the king of alternative sexual subjectivities. And on the back of that, a couple of dissertations that I just examined that are really pushing in the same direction, and we need to reconsider the equation: adequate advanced citizenship equal emancipation, emancipation equals sexual liberation. We need to reconsider that on consumeristic grounds. Doesn't mean consuming certain, for instance, the boom of the lingerie industry would be one, but the boom of, you know, the entire sexual sector, the pornographization of our entire social sphere. So that consumerism in that sense, and also consumerism in terms of identities, that we now can proliferate into all sorts of variations of sexual identities. How about retreating from all of that? People also call it neo asceticism. And it's a very interesting, we're interested to see what this does to the Siska Dresdenhaus and to the great high priestesses of emancipatory politics that are pushing a certain line that seems to me very, very outdated. This may have an impact then on what kind of parameters we would put to the sort of informal conception of democratic life, because if there is a shift of the consensus that actually emancipation equals sexual liberation, then we could look at the entire blasphemy issue quite differently. If it is a consensus towards liberation from and not through sexuality, then I would consider it a major step forward. And in Foucault's career, there's an annotation, I said that I think in one of my lectures, and this shift happens in 79, after he covers the Iranian Revolution. He covered the Iranian Revolution as a reporter, pretty bad reporter, but and he watched what he called the rise of political theology in Iran. He welcomed the Islamist revolution, saying here is the return of political theology, and then from that moment on he just changes his work around and looks at this second phase, which is a very critical of the sort of Western models of emancipation. So this is kind of how it fits into our reasoning, and then I thought from this maybe some looking at again at some of these informal conceptions to see how they would then affect the discussion on what it would mean to insult and offend, and even maybe even being a virgin may stop being a term of abuse, and it may start, as Irigaray argues, may start actually being something to value, but not in the traditional model, but rather as a retreat from. So this is just an annotation from the angle of social theory and philosophies I do.
I was wondering when I heard you talking, I'm not into ethics or into philosophy at all, but hearing you talking about liberation through sexuality and liberation from sexuality, what does that do to the discussion on blasphemy? Can you draw a parallel with blasphemy and say that perhaps arguing for the right to blaspheme, you are trying to achieve liberation through blasphemy, but we should go to a liberation from blasphemy? Or is that too far-fetched?
Well, I don't think that it's adequate to take blasphemy as the one that fits in here instead of sexuality, but rather religion. namely, you know, Sarah said that I'm more or less excluding religious people from the outside by my normative theory, which is a problem. Yeah, and in the say 70s, 80s, there were authors making the argument that only secular arguments are allowed to enter to public debate. This means emancipation, or being an acknowledged citizen means emancipation from religion. Yeah, whereas you're obviously more interested in saying that I wouldn't say, I'm not so into extremes, but I would say we need to at least make it possible being a good, competent citizen, but at the same time being a pious Muslim, Christian, or Jewish person. Yeah. So this emancipation, or also it needs to be possible to be a liberal citizen, or so, but at the same time being visible and having a body, as it were, that can be recognized as a religious body or as a religious person. Yeah, and this is, I mean, the whole debate about, for example, wearing headscarves or so. There is a sort of tendency to pull people out of public sphere, yeah, because of their appearance as religious people. Yeah? And this would be, in my view, quite problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my argument runs more in terms of offense. If you look at the extent to which offense and sexualization overlap, I mean, and in youth culture, the F word, which is the mother F word, or bitch is a normal term for just being a woman, from what I understand these days, or slut is a term of, yeah, hello you slut, and yeah, thank you, and you slut, thank you. What I mean is a term of abuse or as a compliment. There is an overlap between, not only blasphemy, although it plays a role, and inside it plays a role also, you call the divinity in those names, but sex as a term of abuse, and sexualization as a road to blasphemy, or as a road to insulting individuals. And this is where the argument could be. But what does that say? That we're using sexuality in pornography and rape to diminish and kill and destroy, but also in offense and abuse as a form of verbal violation. What does it mean that sexuality is positioned like this? And I think that's the Foucauldian argument. It's positioned like this because we have an equation in our mind that to be sexually evolved, liberated, is to be modern. That equation is to be questioned. I think if you question it from the angle of sexuality, you do get to the offense, and in my opinion to the blasphemy, because it is through sex that we're getting at these things. And Madonna does it beautifully. The crucifixion is intercourse as well as, it is S&M intercourse as well as violation. I mean, it's sex of a kind. It's torture, and it's S&M, it's all of that imaginary that she puts, as well as the classical blasphemy. So I think we'd have to look at the location of sexuality in this. And again, that's what made me think of Foucault, so that's a long-winded answer. That would be more the analogy than one-on-one liberation from blasphemy. You look very worried.
Well, I never saw this. Actually, I never saw this clip like you, obviously. So
well, with all my experience in S&M.
And on the other hand, I'm not that happy with. I do understand your arguments, and I agree with most of them. But on the other hand, I don't agree with saying that sexuality means nowadays consumerism or so. You know, that's a little bit too fast in my view. But I see the problems that you addressed, and I agree that they are problematic. And therefore, we don't have to go into this.
Because it's too problematic.
No. But I mean, it's just part of human life, and I don't see that people who just have enjoyable experiences so are consumeristic or so. You know, I can see this.
No, I was thinking, for an example, the debate on gay marriage, the consumerism argument played a role. A lot of the gay community said we don't want gay marriage because it simply means, you know, gay wedding cakes and gay wedding rings, and, you know, opening up more spheres to consumerism. It was a very powerful argument, which we all disregarded and went ahead anyway. But there is a sense in which, again, Foucault, more liberalization means more consumption than it is here. more sex shops for different type of constituencies, more mailing orders, sort of more consumer. But okay, that takes us somewhere we don't want to go.
The very last thing you said and more, and I was thinking of the argument you made at some point as instead of putting laws against blasphemy, by the way, which I entirely agree with that argument, that instead of restricting speech to have more speech, I'm not convinced by the more speech argument, because precisely in a consumerist context, in a neoliberal context, proliferation of speech, of whatever, it might, there's a question, I guess it's the same question of power relations, like which speech actually counts, because just more speech in itself, I don't see how that necessarily can be an answer to...
Yeah, sure. But I didn't say that it's more speech in itself. I said that there might be even a part of civic virtue that includes the sort of obligation to criticize people who contribute to the shaping of informal conceptions of human life, of democratic life that are anti-religious, in this case of blasphemy, or anti-feminist in other cases, or anti-homosexual in again other cases, and so on. Yeah. So this is, I say the adequate remedy is not restrictions of freedom of expression, legal or informal ones, but it's a sort of invitation or even sort of an obligation to watch over this informal democratic, informal conceptions of democratic life, and if necessary intervene. So this is what I wanted to say. Yeah.